Baghdad now, I guess, you know.
They're at the airport.
Oh, boy, I tell you, it's really discouraging. And we've lost the BBC. They're not bringing the BBC programming. It seems to me like they were.
Oh, really?
On Channel 21.
21 is what I watched it on the Long Island
watching,
station.
But they don't seem to be airing it. It seems to be, network seems to be a wholly owned subsidiary of the White House.
It's really
It
something.
is.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm prejudiced.
This is concentration.
This is, without getting BBC or something else, you know, it's really hard to figure out what's going on.
It does seem to me. Welcome very much to Conversation. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program two gentlemen here, and I'd like to set the date if I could. This is April 3rd of the year 2003. The American forces and so forth are just moving in on the city of Baghdad as we talk. It's being reported, and we want to talk about that and then some of the implications of the countervailing peace movement, one might say, or the people movement. It seems to have sprung up all around the world in an amazing dimension and very rapidly and so forth, perhaps an evolutionary event, possibly. But if I would, I want to introduce two guests and then we'll get into a conversation. And on my far left is Dr. Sidney Greenfield. He's a professor emeritus now. He was at the University of Wisconsin. He's in Columbia now. And he's a person concerned with social policy and so forth. And Sidney, welcome really very much to Conversation.
Thank you, Henry.
Immediate left is Michael Ratner. Michael Ratner has been, you can help set us straight, Michael, but he's been very involved with this movement around the UN trying to have there be called into effect, as I understand, the Resolution 377, Uniting for Peace, to get a calling of the General Assembly, and he's at the Center for Constitutional Rights. And Michael Ratner, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you for having me, and nice to be here with you.
My great pleasure. And I wonder, maybe we could, maybe you could start it out, Michael, because there's been a great deal on the net and so forth about this, this potential for the utilization of Resolution 377, Uniting for Peace, to have called a calling of the General Assembly. Wonder maybe you could share with us a little bit of the history of that resolution, its relevancy, where it stands, and what the implications of its effective utilization might be.
Sure. Uniting for Peace is a resolution or a procedure at the United Nations by which you can move a matter out of the Security Council and into the General Assembly. And what it has a great name, Uniting for Peace, because it basically is the idea that the countries of the world, all 191 countries of the United Nations, get together in a General Assembly and they decide on taking measures that can guarantee and protect the peace. It comes into play in only a very narrow instance, an instance when the Security Council cannot reach unanimity. The permanent members can't reach unanimity on a resolution, and there's a threat to the peace.
That's the situation we're in now.
That's the situation now.
France and England,
France and England are going to veto anything that the U.S. puts up, and the U.S. is going to veto anything that France puts up.
Well, England won't veto this one. They vetoed Suez, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. That's correct. So you have a situation of lack of unanimity in the Security Council. The history of the resolution is actually quite interesting because it was actually, it came up and the idea for it was from the United States originally, some almost 50 years ago. Something like that, because the U.S. was always concerned about a Soviet veto in the Security Council, and they wanted a way to get around the Soviet veto, take a matter to the General Assembly, get around the Security Council Soviet veto. The U.S. was also then one of the first countries to actually use the procedure. They used it in 1956. I know some listeners may recall when the Suez Canal was nationalized by Nasser in Egypt. The United Kingdom and France didn't like that, along with Israel. They invaded Egypt. They took back the canal. The U.S. then went to the General Assembly. There was a veto of a resolution for France and the U.K. to get out of Egypt. They refused, obviously, because there was a veto. They said no Security Council. And then what happened? The United States used Uniting for Peace, took it into the General Assembly, where there was a very lopsided vote at that time to tell France and the U.K. get out of Egypt within a week. France and UK are out of Egypt,
and
it works.
Eisenhower was very much behind that.
That's correct,
wasn't he?
Eisenhower
was
part
of the reality.
Was a key player here.
So
it's a very good procedure if we can get it done. We tried to get it done before the war started.
Yes, indeed.
We did a lot of lobbying. We visited embassies, missions, etc. We tried a worldwide movement. We obviously were unable to do that. We're still working on it now as a way of trying to get a ceasefire resolution out of the General Assembly. We're on the verge of it. Here we are on this day. We're a little more of a push. I think we actually could get this into the General Assembly.
Okay, that's really interesting. And
that
would be
the sad part, though, is France and England were minor players at the time vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the United States. Now we're dealing with just the United States as the major power, and that sort of shifts things around in terms of what you're capable, realistically, of doing.
Makes the world much harder.
Yeah, and the United States seems to have, maybe you could help set me straight, but the United States seems to have flaunted a great deal of the hard-won international law, body of international law, or the institution of the United Nations itself, in terms of this very unilateral direction of we are going to do it no matter what, and they've just taken that, they've got the bit in their mouth, and they're running with it, and they're now...
It's clear. The United States basically, there's only two ways you're allowed to go to war after the Second World War. Self-defense, which is an armed attack or an imminent attack, we don't fit that, or the authority of the Security Council. We didn't get that, and the U.S. just said, heck with the United Nations, we're going to go and do this anyway.
The heck with the body of international law.
Heck with the whole law that basically says you can't go to war except in these circumstances, both under the Charter as well as under fundamental norms of international law. You can't do it, and we're doing it.
Yeah, have they violated in any kind of way, do you think, the United States? And the neocon people seem to have taken, I said before we came on the camera, that I feel like I live in a country that has had experienced what is very close to like a coup d'etat, in terms of the takeover of the operation of this government and therefore the world by a small group of ideologues called neocons and so forth. Have they gone and have they breached, as it were, or overreached in terms of the body of international law, where there can be long-term consequences that along the lines of impeachment or anything along those lines? Is there any point of their being called into account the International Criminal Court, that sort of thing? Well, or how do we deal with this rogue nation that seems to be galloping so quickly now into brand new geopolitical territory?
My view is they have to adhere to international law, international institutions and multilateral institutions. They made our world more dangerous, not less dangerous. The UN is only one part of this. I mean, as you mentioned, the International Criminal Court, we refused to ratify the International Criminal Court. I happen to represent the Guantánamo detainees. They refused to follow the Geneva Conventions with regard to those people. They obviously rejected the Kyoto Accord. I mean, they basically, we could keep going, the ABM Treaty. They've essentially tossed international law and the idea that we're an international player out the window, and they're essentially becoming a rogue state, in my view,
that's the way it
in
seems
terms
to
of
me.
international law.
But can a rogue state be brought to the bar anywhere, or is it not a matter of the winners write history? The winners are never put in the dock. If they are able to pull this off, then it becomes academic, or where do we stand in terms of the rule of law and some sort of principles of rule of law that might apply?
Yeah, well, this is the point that I was going to make, and the question becomes, who is going to make them? We can say all we want in terms of precedent and past, and I think if we look back at history, as you say, it's the winners who make the laws and decide how they should be interpreted. And I think we're sitting here just representative of almost the whole world that's once again looking in on this and saying, oh my God, isn't that horrible? What can be done about it? I think
the New York Times said there's two superpowers, famously said, the United States of America and world opinion. And there has been, isn't it, I can remember back to Vietnam, it took a long time for there to be built, 4
or 5 years at least.
Yeah, a long time, built up slowly. But this had happened almost overnight. People jumped up all over the world, had demonstrations that were all in huge proportion, and the New York Times says, so it's a war against the superpower, United States of America, and the people of the world. And to a very real sense, it could be sounding like, some soundbite or something, but to a sense, it really represents reality. The world is over, the people of the world, and also many of the governments even of the world, are overwhelmingly against this effort that's been exerted by the United States, and the people who are operating that view from the United States seem to think they're on the verge of achieving this fait accompli, very handily done victory. And it is a phenomenon.
I think that's what, we're obviously pessimistic in many respects. We have been taken over by a clique in this government, and it is really essentially a coup that's happened here both domestically as well as internationally.
I'm not off base on that.
No,
but
that's
a very serious matter.
But I think optimistically is what you're saying is right, is that there's a worldwide peace movement has been created, and going outside of governments that is our potential and hope for the future, in my view. And that's what gives me optimism.
Yeah, I just want to add that if there's another way to think about this, and you could see in the history of the United States that the pendulum has swung back. Because for the last 50 years, or so, and I think you mentioned this elsewhere earlier, really since the Roosevelt reforms, there has been something put in place in the United States that's moved in the direction of greater civil rights, opening, etc., that represents one segment of American tradition and culture. There was another one as represented by the conservative right wing, particularly the religious right wing, that has fought this constantly. Well, what has happened is this pendulum swung, and this segment now sits in the White House. The other segment that has really run the United States for the last half century is looking aghast what can be done about it. And I think your point that maybe the recognition of this could lead to reaching out to other people in the world, that maybe, and I think what becomes critical in all this, unless the people who represent the position we're talking from can take back the government of the United States in the next election, we're in for a very, very long haul of continuing to see what is happening, starting in Iraq, and where it's going to go next, nobody knows.
Yeah, because they've said, they've announced you got Iran with nuclear facilities and this sort of thing. And
they got Korea out there, North Korea, they got Syria, they got...
And if you've got an open-ended thing on something called terrorism, it's just open-ended to where they could be having forces everywhere, all over.
Forces, and it has dramatic effects here. Look at in New York, we know we had a march actually refused by a court because of terrorism. And as long as there's a permanent war on terrorism that could go 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're talking about serious draconian restrictions on our civil rights in this country.
That's right. And they had the Patriot Act. They had Patriot Act. They're working on Patriot Act 2 now, and there's already erosion of that sort of thing. And in the fear and the existential fear, perhaps, that is being generated by this thing, people will flock to authority. They did in Germany in the 1930s.
I think the fear thing is a huge factor. As long as they keep people scared, they're not going to care if 3,000 Muslims are stuck in jail. I think that's right. That's right. And then they can do that, and they can project that outward. Now, this calling of the resolution at the UN, we're here talking where it's on the edge. It may be that they're going to do this. What's the reality over there? They tried to do something in the Security Council, and they're trying to institute this. I think they're calling it a special session. There's two ways they can go. They can go with either calling it a special session, which would be a continuation of the 10th special session, which is on Palestine, Israel, or they could try and get what's called the Uniting for Peace as a separate agenda item, as a new special item, which is, I think, the way that's preferred to go, because you don't have to squash it into another agenda. But the key here is really getting the key countries here to call it, and I think what's happening is they want to make sure they have enough countries on their side to be able to basically come out with a very solid resolution calling for a ceasefire. If it's going to be a close vote, the U.S. is going to look at that as a victory. So you want to make sure out of the 191 countries you don't get 50 abstentions or 60. You want, I mean, the U.S. is never going to get a majority. No one thinks that. But you may get a lot of countries who are afraid to punch the U.S. in the face again a little bit. And the U.S. has made it clear. The U.S. has actually sent out a letter to every single one of the countries saying we don't want a General Assembly meeting.
Well, there's no reason to call it a General Assembly meeting. The ball's in play, and that's it.
What they said.
Everything's going well, so they don't want that because it might be a source of embarrassment.
Right, embarrassment, interference, they said with them, and they said they'd look unkindly on it. Well, when a little country sitting out there in Africa says, the United States,
package,
right, looking to get into like some, trade tariff situation or getting Bulgaria into NATO or whatever the coercion the U.S. can use, they're sitting there saying, well, maybe we already got the U.S., we already have an argument it's illegal war, why do we want to go any farther?
Yeah, and they're doing that. They're lobbying the nations of the world hard on this particular issue of not wanting to see this called, because if nothing else it would be, if this, what is the reality in terms of the people? You see in Turkey, 95% of the people are against the war. Even in Britain they had, and in other countries around the world. Indonesia is 99%.
Amazing.
Indonesia is
remarkable.
So they have this. Is that opposition going to hold, do you think? Is the oppositional force that has the anti-war sentiment that's jumped up before the war was actually declared and so forth, going to hold, but now that the fat's in the fire, as they say, people will overlook that and it will dissipate, or do you think it's going to grow? Is it an evolutionary event, possibly, that the people whoever would have thought the people of the world would have anything to say about anything? It's always the leaders. What is it? You're a sociologist. Is it a sociological event and a shift of geopolitical power basis?
I think off the top we've had a lot of examples of protests, people protesting in the streets. The critical issue is what impact do people have on their governments. And I think what we're realizing more and more that there's a disjuncture between governments and what governments do and what people
That's an interesting fact,
And
because that goes into a lot of different dimensions.
Depressing in some way.
But it goes beyond. And you see, if I can carry this in another direction, I think what it begins to get a lot of us to realize is that the way we have organized ourselves, and this becomes true not only in governmental affairs, but in economic affairs, the way we have organized ourselves doesn't work for most of the people.
That's a big assumption because we had all these systems come out of the the IMF and the Bretton Woods and this kind of thing, and yet Joe Stiglitz and other people will tell us that the pattern that's going is something where the rich are getting richer and the poor are not being served. 60–80% of the population of the world, and those people are beginning to stir in terms of the model that's being offered by the Western powers. And you have Argentina has imploded. Following the IMF, structural adjustments.
That's right.
So that the model that we're presenting, and is now that model is being enforced with brute strength by a hard right reaction to the world on this thing of terrorism and so forth. It's a dangerous situation. But can the people ever rise up against it in an effective way, or is that some sort of an idealistic something that, geopolitics has always taught us just a matter of the rulers take care and the people do whatever they're told,
Harold, having raised Argentina, if you stop and ask the question, what does the United States have in mind for Iraq should this war be over? Okay. And instead of focusing on the protests for a moment, if we jump ahead to look at the future, and I think the people in Washington, if they really had their druthers, what they would want in Iraq is something that would be modeled after Argentina, almost to the letter. Argentina, in the sense that Argentina represented very much of the kind of democracy that they talk about now in Washington, with popular representation and a whole series of other things. Argentina, remember, was the poster child for neoliberal economics until what you were talking about, the enormous greed, if you will, by those who controlled the system said, well, Argentina has to shape up just a little bit more, to the point at which Argentina did implode, and nobody cared whether it implodes or not. The issue becomes whether or not governments can control their populations, particularly in economic terms, to serve this global system that has been created out of Washington.
That's right. Well, and they're setting up, and they have this market fundamental. We talk about Islamic fundamentalism or something. They have a market fundamentalism that everything can be done through the market. I don't know if it's Friedman or Bob Mandela, supply side people, but the neocons with Wolfowitz and what's his name? The people that make up that thing. Well, they're going to set up an administration. I saw a thing in The Guardian. They said they're going to set up an administrative thing of ministries, all run by Americans. It'll be overseen
really shocking
by,
to see
by
what they're
Wolfowitz.
doing, actually.
And it sounds awfully like to a lot of the people that it's a model that is very close to what has been the traditional colonial model that has been imposed by Britain in the past, and we're just going to whip all those wogs into shape or something.
The Iraqi opposition is going to be like advisors to the ministry, but we're going to be the entire control of the whole
Paul
system.
Wolfowitz at the top. And he's got an economic philosophy that is also informing the tax cut, which is a big thing that they're the singular thing of the Bush administration, to give overwhelmingly more of the wealth of the country to the already wealthy. And it's a metaphor perhaps for the world.
Well, yeah.
And so then the people are, in a certain sense, ignored to the interests of the plutocrats, the wealthy, and that's a model that they want to impose and think that there can be a workable systems efficiency on a world scale? Or, I don't know, what do you think?
I was at a seminar yesterday up at Columbia on how Iraq came into being when the state was first created after the First World War.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating how speaker after speaker, in reconstructing what was happening when at British instigation Iraq was created as a nation, the words that we used to describe what the British government said were exactly the same words that are coming out of Washington. And of course, the interesting thing was what Britain wanted was free trade in the same way. What they realized is that people are creative and keep bringing in new things. It didn't work between 1915, say, and the present, and now we go back, wipe it all away, or at least this isn't the intent, and replace it with Americans now rather than British to do the administration so that they will do exactly the same thing to make free trade possible, but free trade that is structured in favor of not only the United States and Great Britain, but also those rich segments of the United States and Great Britain. And this is what is to be imposed first in Iraq, and then we don't know where next.
Yeah, and they might also be not only the Great Britain and colonial powers in that direct sense, but also in a certain sense, on a certain scale, the plutocratic few within the nations of the world, they will be aligned with the plutocrats, whether in gated communities or whatever, they will, because they don't have a model, which, if Mr. Stiglitz is right, that is going to bring something like justice. Justice is perhaps an overworked term, but even systems efficiency in terms of being able to effectively engage the masses of the people of the world, and whether or not the masses will just long suffer, as they have, because there seems no alternative, or could this signaling of an opposition to this over-the-top stance that the United States has led signal a real uprising on a large scale of the masses of the people of the world who have not been well served by the geopolitical leaders that have been imposing their system on it? And that's the question. Is it an evolutionary event?
That's the question
possibly?
of how.
What do you think?
Well, I guess the question of how, because I agree. I think,
Okay.
we're at this point where we have seen a huge movement out there of people.
We really do.
Huge.
Yeah.
And one of the things, of course, the internet and the communication system allows us really, I work with lawyers from England, I work with them from Canada, I work with people all over the world now. When we talk about war crimes, it goes all over the world if they bomb a market or something like that. And everybody gets out there right away around this Resolution 377. There's people everywhere. So that's a positive thing that gives me more hope. But really, if you were to ask me, where does the peace movement go next? I don't have the answer. I mean, what is the next step for that? So that's one question. The other question, and I'd be interested in Sydney's views on this, is you have now maybe a recognition by countries like France and Germany, as much as they were sort of in our bloc, maybe a recognition that they can't just attach themselves at the hip to the United States, and maybe they have to create another kind of bloc for themselves that's going to give us some resistance. That would be my the one possibility. The U.S. has been so outrageously, basically unilateralist and off the charts that other countries are beginning to recognize maybe we got to not just we have to have our own economic sphere as well as maybe we have to have our own military sphere.
Michael, there are two things that you've talked about that you've packaged together. And one becomes Harold's question, what about people with respect to the institutions that dominate society? And then you're talking about governments, what governments of France and other places can do. These are separate issues, and I think it becomes perfectly understandable that the governments of France and other countries will manipulate ways that might be to their advantage. That doesn't necessarily mean this is going to make things any better for the population.
I think that's right.
So the question
it may restrain the United States to some extent, but what the effects of that will be. In other words, right now we have a situation when you talked about the drawing of Iraq, after the First World War, the redrawing of the map, Sykes-Picot or Sykes-Picot.
Right.
Basically, one analysis here is after every world war, the victors redraw the map of the world. England and France did it after First World War, U.S. and Russia after the Second, and now after the Cold War, the U.S. alone is doing it. So that's, on some level, on a broad level, that's what's going on, and I think maybe the other countries aren't going to let that happen as long as, maybe they're going to try, maybe. But
well, they can try, but this again represents the matter of power that we're
that's
talking
right.
about. And
Not
the
the
United
people.
States, in terms of sheer power, it is very hard for anyone to stand up or organize
Nobody's
against
close
the
now,
United
right?
States. Nobody is in the ballpark.
not even.
But then again, even if they were, if we did it using the same institutions, what we would get is, so the United States, if you go back to the end of World War II, was a minor player in world power systems. Right. Now we've come along and grown to the point that we're the imperial power. What it again says to me is that the systems we're working with don't work. They keep coming back. You get different players.
That's
and
true.
the issue
That's right.
becomes, how do you create new institutions?
And but can that people's movement out there be pushed,
be a catalyst?
Be a catalyst, and it can actually do that. I mean, one instance I had of that, is the landmines treaty. All the governments of the world basically were refusing to do anything about landmines. Right. All these groups and NGOs and non-governmental organizations got together and they got themselves a landmines treaty outside of the governments. And I'm just trying to think if there's a way that these people's movements can be put into that kind of thing.
That's getting to do it. The question that I would raise is, now where do you get the models for alternative forms of organization? As we've talked before, alternative systems of distributing the wealth that has been created on this planet that is controlled by a very small segment worldwide.
That's right.
With representations in every country in the world.
Right. The plutocrats.
Yeah.
The plutocrats in the world really own the wealth of the
Call
nation.
them what they like, but the point is they run the show, and the question becomes, how do you create a new means of distributing these resources to the overwhelming majority of the people on the earth who are the ones who are protesting, the ones who are complaining, the ones who have been left out.
And they're growing.
And they're growing.
They're growing in
And
proportion.
the one thing we know is that Marx was wrong because they're not going to rebel. They're in no position to do that.
It's a very hard thing for people to rebel. Although even
they want to just keep their family together. I mean, they want to feed their few little, what are you going to do? Take
well, it might even come back at a giant level, at a large level, even if it's something as arcane as economic theory or something of that sort, which usually is we just assume we've got it, or large theory. We live in a time we've had, for me, just academic, we live at a time, I bring it up, that we now know, I think it makes sense, mitochondria with 200,000 years. Homo sapien first appeared in the evolution of consciousness and events and so forth. 10,000 generations. We reached a point, Joshua Lederberg tells us, that we reached a point, Mr. Einstein was born, we wrote the theory of relativity, the atomic weapons, super nuclear weapons, or that we reached that point where if those weapons were unleashed, weapons of mass destruction, if they were unleashed in some sort of a guns of August thing where they just get, chaos comes, that we can now know, Joshua Lederberg says, that it would mean the end of our species.
Right.
Now, that's something brand new in the history. We could wipe out the tribe, the other country, or something like that, but now it's the whole species, and there's something going on existentially, or something going on in the course of events. And the adverse side of that would be, are we at a point where if you could take it just, we have this incredible technological capability. It's not only distribution, it's also growth, and an economic system that can actually bring about things that intellectual and scientific understandings we have and so forth, where there can be the appropriate growth and that sort of thing. Do we have a system that allows us to do what it is we're capable of doing at the service of the world population, 6 billion heading for 10? Do we have an appropriate model that's going to work at a systems level for this whole system that James Lovelock calls Gaia, and that there's a whole human organization? Is there a liberating potentiality that would be the adverse side in a yin and yang kind of view of the universe, that the destructive side is that we cross that line of destruction along about 1970?
The
in our
liberating
lifetime?
technology.
And where do we stand? Can we make the world work for everybody in an
The
ecologically
liberating
appropriate
technology that you're talking about, or the liberating process, may be very much what Michael was talking about, the way people are reacting to a specific situation. That may be the process. The question becomes, where do you get models to redesign an economic system for the world that has a little more justice in all this? And the present institutions we have are not going to do this. Let me give you just one example.
That's a big statement.
Let me give you just one example, and this brings me back to Brazil, where I do most of my own research. And last night I was listening to an economist talking about what is happening, because you know there's a new government in Brazil, the hope of the left, the new Lula government. And this economist, interesting, trained at Chicago, the Milton Friedman tradition. But what he gave some very interesting statistics. So here is a new government in Brazil taking a society where 35% of the population are under the poverty line, and raising the question, what can the government do to change this and eliminate poverty? And he said it would take 1% of the GDP of Brazil to eliminate poverty. If you do this through economic growth, it would take Brazil a growth rate of 4.5% per year for 35 years to do this. And this is staggering. Why, though? Because that economic model is based upon the assumption that resources are going to be distributed through jobs.
The labor theory of value.
The labor theory of value.
It informs
and the
all
point
economic
is, today with modern technology, you can't create enough jobs to employ people. So what we wind up again for Brazil, more than 50% of the population of Brazil is in the informal labor market. That is, they're outside the job market, outside the system through which we are going to distribute resources. Now, Brazil is better off than a lot of other places. The question becomes, as long as we stick to the organizational model that distributes wealth through jobs, primarily to the masses only. The rich do it in another way, because we've created entrepreneurship, which is the way that you can siphon off by betting on the markets. You can create great wealth that never gets distributed. So what we're holding out to the rest of the world, particularly the developing world, is this system without telling them, we're going to say, well, in 100 years, maybe enough will trickle down so that you'll get a little piece while we get more and more and more.
So the enemy in that would be, in a certain sense, the labor theory of value itself. And if I may, the Marxists used to talk about the surplus labor theory of value, where where capital was all just stolen labor, and everything comes from human activity. And we got this model where all human activity would distribute income according to what we call jobs. You have plutocrats who own it. They set up the structure of the institutions, and then people can have jobs that they'll be. But it's the plutocrats calling the structure.
And determining in the name of the market how little people can be paid.
How little they can be paid, and also the formula. But that's a big thing, because our system, all economic theory is predicated essentially on the idea of the labor theory of value, that value comes from human activity, and whether it's intellectual or physical labor that they produce, that's how they're going to get income to the masses. And so you have this wage slave system that's in place and seems to be just accepted.
Yeah, but what you have to understand here, again, if I can go back, that economic theory developed in Western Europe in the 17th, 18th century, Adam Smith and Ricardo and the like, that were living in terms of a society organized in a particular way. And what they saw was, in terms of the market, individuals, individual producers, individual consumers, with a market system that distributed goods. Well, if you look at what's happened in the next couple of centuries, we've created huge organizations that have imposed a job system for distributing wealth to enable people to get into the market. Only most of the people in the world are outside this system and are just, the only thing that's being offered to them is the hope that maybe if they're lucky and they don't make trouble, jobs will be created.
So you're saying if Brazil even grows at 4.5% every year for the next 35 years, more jobs will be created, but you're never going to get enough jobs to get the 50% of the informal market into the jobs. That's basically
especially when you take it, and Lula himself is the beautiful example of the poor kid who came out of this rural background and became a worker and got into a union. Well, this burst of unions in Brazil happened at a unique period in time where automobile manufacturing left the United States, moved to Brazil for cheaper wages. They got it. And as soon as labor organized in Brazil, the owners of these companies learned that you outsource.
You go to
and you
another
break
place.
the unions. And then if that requires you to pay wages, you find someplace else and you say 6 billion growing to 10 billion, you find this increasing population someplace that you can get to do it so that profits will be siphoned off and stay high because that's what the markets
and this is what they will impose on the world.
That's right.
As far as we
this
can
is what we're
see
talking
now.
about.
And you're going to have a problem, and I don't know. I know we had a real problem in the 1930s with a worldwide deflationary depression that was a conundrum to everyone. How did this happen? We had great productive capability to provide, and yet people didn't have the demand to buy what was able to be produced. There's a possibility of that now, and yet that's the model that seems to be advanced, and we don't have it even at a theoretical level. What would be the model that would be able to be presented?
What's Lula going to do? What would you recommend?
Yeah, what would Lula do, or what would...
because I read the article where Lula's even restricted because of IMF stuff.
The IMF stuff on top of that.
I mean, on top of it, how much room does he have in a world where the U.S. basically controls the banks and everything else? I mean, it's a big problem for the guy.
Now, this raises a fascinating question, because we ask for models. What are we going to do? And what I find fascinating, Harold, you mentioned, what's his name, Kelso?
Yeah, well, Kelso is the only thing outside of a labor theory of value that I can see.
Okay. Now, isn't it fascinating
that
as we sit here, in the last 50 years, we can think of only one effort to design something new with all the brain power that's going on here. Look for models. Well, you talked earlier that some of my own training was with Carl Polanyi at Columbia University.
He was looking for an alternative
and what
to the two
Polanyi was doing was looking for an alternative to capitalism and communism. This is the whole tradition of his family.
We're still looking for that, I think. Yeah.
And Polanyi was looking at it, and this is how I got to him, because he got together with Konrad Ahrensberg in anthropology and looked at it. And I think what they both neglected was the fact that you can't take models from other places and apply them, because just as the model that Adam Smith came up with, in 200 years, everything has changed.
It's a new ontology.
It's a new world, particularly with technological developments. What we have to do is design something new, and this is not going to be to hope that some bright Albert Einstein is going to sit off in his little corner and say, "Eureka, I've thought up something." What we have to begin to realize, this is going to take groups of people working together. Models like the think tanks that the right, the neocons developed, and the question is going to be, who is going to fund these think tanks? You and I participate in this seminar at Columbia that we talked about, and here is a beautiful place that Columbia University and other universities that have seminar series like that, nobody has decided to organize a seminar to think about these
big issues. The big issues, yeah.
The big issues.
Comprehensive issues.
We narrow in on other issues.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that this is where it's going to have to be done, not to ask the question, what new model can you come up with? Nobody's going to be able to come up with this, but this is what is necessary.
To understand the ontology in a certain sense. There's a new reality that's emerging. And the thing in that depression is that people, they had a productive capability, but people didn't have the ability to buy and clear what the market was able to produce. And we're very likely to be facing a worldwide deflationary depression on this neocon notion that all the wealth can go to the few, and the people are you're going to outsource and so forth. So how are the people going to have the ability to buy? And you need the demand side. They have to have the ability to buy it, and yet also the technology. Not only can you outsource and go to China and say 2 cents an hour, or 10 cents an hour, or something, and exploit that.
There are billions
You've
and
also
billions
got
of
a technological development where the technology is coming now. And Keynes, Lord Keynes himself, said in his letter to his grandchildren, that's about now, he said that you're going to be confronted with something that's going to be really troubling, and that is going to be technological displacement of labor. So and that's software programs that can put CPAs out of work. So there's all kinds of things to displace. So if we're going to distribute all income according to labor standards and by jobs and so forth, we're in deep doo-doo if we don't have some sort of an alternative way of getting income to people's hands so they can buy what's able to be produced. So the supply side thing is so one-sided and so over the top that it won't work, not just justice, but at a systems efficiency level, And so there's something new has to come up. But what are the models that are going to come?
Well, and the question is, when you have all these people out there in movement and you want them to, like I have friends who, like they say, enforce the economic Bill of Rights, give us a job, give us shelter, give us medical care, unless there's a model for it for them to fight
How do you give them jobs? Who's going to create these jobs?
That's the problem. What you're saying is really important, because you have this whole movement out there that of people who you could probably put into action if you had some kind of way of saying, what are our demands, other than going back to the same trough that basically the controllers of the economy.
And maybe the club, if you think about it, is that what has happened is people are not going to sit back and just politely starve to death.
They come up over the long haul.
But they come up with new things constantly. Because another way of looking at the world is to see the rise of religious fundamentalism, for example, is an effort to go back into our mythology to come up with something different. If you will, as horrible as the results were, the Taliban represented something to create, using an ancient myth, something different. People around the world are going to be experimenting, and to what degree that might lead to the terrorism we're so frightened of. Maybe this is the threat that sits out there that might even get some of our leadership to acknowledge the need for revising and redefining some of the organizational aspects of the institutional
Okay, but if we're going to talk about
the
redefining of the organizational aspects, I don't know, here in the United States, superpower, hyperpower, we got this power, we got this capability. They have a very focused, soundbite kind of notion of the world. It's very focused on this supply side notion. They got a whole series of economic assumptions that go with that. They're very together in their thinking and so forth. But, I mean, if you have some sort of opposition, let's say political, realistic opposition. Here we got a problem here on the international scale. Hopefully that resolution 377 can happen. The discontent that's being manifest around the world by the people in giving leeway to the political leadership, because they have to depend on that. They have to survive. That's a reality and so forth. But, I mean, they're getting to... So we should have an opposition. We have an opposition. We're supposed to have something like called a Democratic Party. They've been supine. They've been supine, it seems to me, and in terms of they're trying to weigh the advantages of what the likelihood, and then when they come forth, what are they going to offer as an alternative to what the current leadership is offering in high definition, as it were?
The Democratic Party has been terrible.
You think that way? It seems that way to me.
Supine is the right word on everything.
Harold,
but,
And why is that?
To think about this in terms, to think about this in terms of the United States, though, I think is putting our focus in the wrong place. Because remember, what's the percentage of the world's resources that the United States consumes.
Now it's around
40,
25%. It was 40 after the Second World War, and now
right.
it's 25%.
25.
Is that about what it is now?
5% of the
60%
people and
of the population?
25% of the population.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, in the United States, we have gotten the fruits of what has happened from this system. Okay? To think in the United States about developing these alternatives is the different. You got to think from the perspective of the 75% of the world that's sitting outside.
You know, Sidney, I agree with you on that. I think that's right. I think
that's right.
I think the idea of really making that kind of social change in the United States right now, structural change, almost impossible.
You do, because the institutions are so in place?
Well, no, because we benefit. The people in this country
we talk
really
about
benefit
unemployment
from it.
like
co-opted
6%. 6% unemployment.
Would that be the case of the developed world in general, do you think? I mean, that would be the case. So we've got a dialectic between the wealthy, and we're part of the wealthy, just collectively as a society. We have problems, though, within our own, and there are going to be problems that are going to be developing within our own society as well. We have a divided nation now on this issue, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
See, and out of the World Social Forum and the movements that led up to it, we missed the point that we raised earlier, the difference between people and governments. Now, we talk about the world of the rich and the world of the poor, meaning the governments that represent the poor and the rich, the developed, the underdeveloped.
But usually the governments represent the rich.
That's right.
Because look what happens at the WTO stuff. They want the poor countries want to make sweatshop deals.
Sure.
In a second, because they want to bring that industry in, right away. So that's correct.
So that's a problem.
I think the World Social Forum is really interesting. Were you there? I wasn't there.
No, I wasn't there.
People told me it was
unfortunately.
extraordinary.
Yeah,
in terms
that woman Roy from India is really.
And you could see this is, since it was held in Brazil, this was part of the movement that led to Lula getting elected. And the sad part of it is they don't have the models right now to turn to. They're faced with the pressures from the United States, even should they succeed. And if that one should fail, wow, there's going to be so little hope.
That's true.
Left.
But right now we've got this government that's running roughshod over a lot of international law, even the Constitution. Ramsey Clark has a thing forth based on the notion of impeachment, based on the violation of the Constitution of the United States, and Francis Boyle has one based on international law largely and so forth. That's there. These kind of things we have that developing in a lot. There's this opposition, and the question is it going to be able to become a force? And does it need some sort of a vision that is going to make that force be sustainable in an effective way against the plutocratic interests of the ruling few nations, and then the people within each of the nations of the world that have a certain kind of alliance against the people? Are the people going to be able to maybe have an effect? The government of Turkey had to answer to the mass discontent in Turkey when they didn't vote to let the troops come into Turkey. I mean, they were answering a democratic call by the people. The government in Indonesia is pretty restrained by anything other than an anti-war sentiment, because it's 99% of the people are intently against that. So is that going to become a force that could begin to create a context for political leadership that would be more investigative of something other than the pattern of thinking that might come out of all of this? And could that be an evolutionary event in terms of world social, political, economic development?
I would hope so in other countries. I see that as a great potential.
You do,
Yeah, but in this country, the efforts of all of us, which, we're all doing to try and isolate and demonstrate, the nature of the current government here, which is really a clique of people running the place, but representative of, a certain rich, wealthy part of the society, neocon, whatever you want to call it. I think we're able to do a lot, but I think the best we're going to get out of it at this point, I mean, the thinking is not going that far. The best, if you talk to progressive people, is to put some Democrats in, because at least they're not going to be these guys. I mean, I don't know, but that's, I think, where what we're talking about here.
And
there is nothing on the political horizon in the United States that will even address the questions we're raising. Again, and I think you can say
where can they be addressed? Where would they be addressed? Could there be a movement, like we're here in media, I mean...
I think it's important to get rid of these guys running this government right now, because these guys are worse than the other guys.
This is step number one.
But I agree with what Sidney's saying.
Yeah.
The alternative we're talking about, what am I talking about here? Kerry or Edwards or,
Yeah, right.
We're not talking about fundamentally changing
And we're
the
not
nature of
talking
what
about
we're-
people who are even going to take on the issues that we're raising.
And it may be that the times call for a fundamental change of some sort that is an adverse side.
And
That there's
this is where-
that there's a capability that is staggering in terms of being able to provide for the needs. Given the collective development of knowledge and capability, we could make this planet work for
But what Sydney's saying is
everyone.
like if you were to go out now in the streets in America or anywhere, there's a poverty of ideas of how to do it. I mean, you're right.
And the
Where is
point
the
is
lack? Is it
something is
not-
going to be done.
Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. That's a political...
But all life is local.
But in a certain sense, one could say, in a certain sense, all politics is economic. It has to do with economic, and we have a flawed, fundamentally flawed, systems-wide, inappropriate understanding of reality in terms of the basis by which our economic theory is based. You identified it,
Okay.
the labor theory of value, and that we have this technological capability. It isn't, I don't think we've changed that much biologically through time.
No, it
genetically
has
or
nothing to
something.
do with
But what
biology.
has changed and what altered the situation where we can destroy the whole species and a good deal of the top end of the biological process has been the technological extensions of our
And you see,
consciousness.
Harold, what's going
So
to
the
happen?
technology has changed.
What is going to happen is what has happened for the last 50,000 years. Groups of people are going to try to create something new that may work a little better for them. And what we have to watch out for is that whether or not this group in Washington looks at every creativity, every innovation as a potential threat and defines it as terrorism.
Well, they're
Well,
doing
that's
it.
certainly,
they
it's like
do-
the old guys looked at communism like that.
Yeah.
Every single change, let's say Nicaragua wasn't going to go be a communist country. Let's say it was going to try and be a mixed economy of some sort, communism. So they did the same labeling of every attempt at finding an alternative economic model. Boomo.
That's one of the
And what it
big-
becomes is
communism.
now you talk about television, somehow somebody's got to reach out to people who watch television and get the opportunity to say, hey, wait a second, if you understand the limitations of the world that we live in, especially for the rest of the world, they're going to be creating and inventing new things in terms of their tradition if we accept defining everything new as a potential threat to us. We're in a lifelong war against everybody else on the planet.
Yeah, that's right. And does it come out of the existential situation where we find ourselves? It really is something new in the fact that we can now destroy the species.
Oh, yeah.
That's something new. That's
And the point is we are sitting with the biggest weapons to do it.
What might be, we have them, and we have the and we have the paranoia, and we have the, very dangerously, we could flail out, or it could happen guns of August or something. But what would be a comparable adverse side in an evolutionary scale to that kind of a proposition, that ontology, that projection of reality that we can destroy ourselves? When we say, we can say it trippingly off our tongue, that Bucky Fuller, God bless him, he came up with a thing where he tried to measure haveness and so forth. He had the idea that we had a growing technologically augmented capability of providing within some sort of a reasonable context for the people of the world, where he said we crossed the line where there were more haves than have-nots in terms of our capability for the first time in 200,000 years of human history. We crossed that line right about 1970. That we were, in a certain sense, transcending as an ontologic reality the ironclad laws of scarcity themselves, which has been the basis on which all human institutions have been formulated. Maybe we're transcending scarcity as a reality.
Theoretically.
Theoretically, that's right.
In capability.
Right. No, in potential.
But you see,
the question is, how do you do it, Harold?
Right.
No, but I would suggest that one thing might be, is there anything to that? Or is that just wool-gathering nonsense? Is that something to be dismissed? It is dismissed out of hand by all of our policy assumptions. There's not nearly enough. It's got to be me. It's got to be, it's got, the traditional
the
things,
scarcity
economics
assumption
itself,
is what you're talking about,
and
is basing distribution on scarcity and the labor theory of value.
Well, those
and
are
the
two
point
big things
is,
that might be
but the point that you're making is that, yes, we have the potential to produce enough for everybody.
That's not a small matter.
No, this is a tremendous accomplishment.
Within a context where everybody, they used to have an old expression in the 19th century. They said everybody would have a competence. You can't have non-scarcity that you're not in a situation of having, unless you have a swimming pool full of diamonds. Okay. In order, they get some sort of an absurd notion of what happiness is. But within the idea that everybody have a sufficiency onto what it is they have, their reasonable needs and wants and so forth, is that we get to that point. Okay, we get to that point. We have a competence, yes, and that that we've reached that point where we could provide that. Maybe there's a major transformation taking place that is signaling something new, which is the adverse side of the second one, and
the
we
more
don't pay
potential
attention
there
to
is, and actually the more that's produced, yet the greater the disparities between the rich and the poor. So something's happening that's completely not working, right?
Yeah.
Completely, all that productivity is going to a smaller and smaller group of people.
And again, the question
becomes, why is that happening if that's the case?
How do you distribute it?
Right.
How do you take what we're capable of producing and distribute it in another way?
Yeah.
And then,
other than
when
labor,
you
other than labor, other than jobs, you're going to get money to people
No. And you see, what you're doing is you're having the difficulty, as we all have, of imagining some other alternative. And what I'm saying is this is something that either people will work it out on their own, as bizarre as it will come, or we need these think tanks and seminars that will be able to devise alternative systems that can be worked through in a process from what we have to transform it.
Well, it might be that would be informing us, but so these are big questions that have to be raised, and it should be on the intellectual. If we've transcended scarcity as an ontologic reality, that would be something to be front and center, because it changes the context.
Well, I think we've done that. I just think the problem is, where's it going?
No, but if we've done that in a way that we haven't had that in the past, something's changed within our lifetime.
Right.
So that's something to be investigated. But the problem right now we have is, I'm sorry, we're going to be running out of time. And the world will be running out of time with these Gada-Ramadan kinds of possibilities that are there now.
Right.
And Michael, I just want to really thank you really very much for having taken the initiative on this 377.
I appreciate
let's
that.
Let's hope that this can lead to a calling of a General Assembly session that could be a focus for a great deal of people voicing their discontent toward what's going on in terms of the situation in Iraq. It's an institutional thing that could bring focus and keep alive that oppositional force that may emerge as part of an evolutionary development that could be a positive transformation of the human condition as we move ahead possibly.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to present it, and I just hope we can at least get that far on something.
Yeah, we're going to give a talk on that tonight. We're going to go to that and appreciate that. And the Center for Constitutional Rights is a major place to guaranteeing the Constitution.
Well, we're trying, I'll put it that way, in the tough times.
It's a tough job. You're up against a tough crew that's really mangling the Constitution in the eyes of many people. And Sid, thanks a lot for coming. We just scratched the surface of a big subject.
I'm not a big economist, so it was very good.
Thank you for having me.
But it's all there, and we touched on a lot of subjects. We thank you for viewing. It's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions. Far left, Sydney Greenfield. He's a anthropologist, and on my immediate left, Michael Ratner, President. Is that the Center for Constitutional Rights, a major institution protecting constitutional liberty, rights, and integrity of our system, and so forth. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We invite Tune. We'll come back again next week. That's it for now. Thank you for viewing.
Great.
So you get some of this in, but it's a huge thing. I just hope this thing can work. If it doesn't, the United States is trying to prevent this from happening.
Yeah, they sure are. They seem very strong.
When would we know if it's going?
I think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen within the next 3 or 4 days.
3 or 4 days.
Yeah, if it doesn't happen, if we don't get a General Assembly meeting called
not
by the end of this week, but by the middle of next week, I think.
Middle of next week, the middle of
I think it may, well, the 8th or 9th, I think. The 9th is when the Arab League said they would want it.
Yeah.
So.
And they were trying to call for a ceasefire.
Right, a ceasefire, but of course we're getting late in the war. Who knows? I mean, you don't know late. You don't know. It depends on what kind of war you're talking about.
The frightening part is for the Arab League to do it is, this is vested interest. It's very easy